Whether or not I like to admit it in public, I was raised in Utah. I wasn't born in Utah, but I spent my formative years in Utah, exploring and enjoying public lands. Now, specifically, I love Utah's national parks. The 5 parks that Utah has is good enough for third in the country of most parks per state, right after California and Alaska. And all 5 of the parks are unique and interesting and engaging. So in today's economic analysis, I specifically wanted to look at something that I'm really passionate about, which is the National Park Service or the National Park System of parks, but more specifically of national parks, units that are designated as national parks. Now, the National Park Service does their own economic analysis within every year within their service, within their department. And they go through park by park, unit by unit, talking about how much those units are worth, both physically, directly, and based on that multiplier of how much does the park actually benefit the community. And here are the sectors that the NPS directly identifies as sectors that are affected by park units in the area: camping, gas, hotels, groceries, recreation industries, things to that effect. And so that's a multiplier, right? Just by having a park in the area, you're going to affect the gas industry in the area and restaurants in the area, retail in the area, transportation in the area. And so going off of this multiplier, the National Park Service has designated or does research next to each one of their units to determine what kind of economic effect they've had. Now, like I mentioned, Utah has a very unique place in this country, having those 5 national parks. And so I wanted to specifically dive into a little bit more, what are the economic benefits of national parks or the National Park Service being in Utah? And so here's some quick information. Let's see if I can move this over. Specifically in the state of Utah is number 5 on all of the main indicators that the National Park Service keeps: visitor spending, jobs, labor income, value added, and economic output across their 13 national park sites. As you can see, they're right up there with North Carolina, Alaska, California, and Arizona, and then the other state changes depending on the indicator. But like I mentioned, you've got these different indicators that Utah consistently performs really well in. And then here are some more specific numbers. So for visitor spending, you've got 1.2 billion, labor income 614 million, jobs 18.9 thousand. And they do these numbers every single year. And when you look at it in context over the whole state's GDP is a little over $300 billion. So when you look at the economic output or the value added, and you compare it with just over $300 billion, it seems like a minimal drop in the bucket. Same thing with jobs. The state of Utah has a little over 3 million individuals that live inside the state. And when you look at jobs, only about 20,000 or 19,000 are created by National Park Service directly or indirectly. And so those numbers don't seem real impressive when you look at it in the context of the whole state. But when you look at it a little bit more directly, when you look at more specifically what the state has in terms of population density, you can notice on this map that most of the population density happens right in the Wasatch Corridor, right along that main line of reds and yellows and oranges. What that doesn't say, or what you may notice by the stars on the map, is that none of those stars are really very close to those main population centers or those main population densities, with a few exceptions, notably Timpanogos Cave National Monument, Zion National Park, and Cedar Breaks National Monument. And so if you take out, if you look at where these parks are, specifically the national parks are in the state of Utah, it opens up and it gives you a little bit more nuance onto the numbers that we were looking at just a minute ago, right? And so when you look at it, no one is suggesting that Timpanogos Cave National Monument is making a huge difference in Utah County. Obviously, there's not a lot of jobs and there's not a lot of economic output that's generated by such a small monument. But when you get more specific, and when you look at regions of the state that are a little bit less populous, places like Wayne County, which is where Capitol Reef is, or Grand County, which is where Arches and part of Canyonlands are, you get to see a little bit more of a clear picture of the role that these national parks play in these tiny little communities. These are some of the smallest counties in the state of Utah. Wayne County is only about 3,000 people large. And over half of that, or over half of that population, is employed as a result of Capitol Reef National Park. And it's millions of dollars in all of these counties. Millions of dollars are generated by the park itself and by the park alone. And so when you look at this in context, when you ignore some of those larger numbers that are statewide and cover mostly Salt Lake County, Davis County, Weber County, and Utah County, and when you get into the more nitty gritty of these small counties, you realize that national parks are playing a huge role. And that's one of the benefits of a lot of the national parks, especially on the west side of the United States, is these national parks exist in tiny communities or in small, not very populous counties. They exist surrounded by communities that are very reliant and very dependent on the tourist appeal and the draw to their community via national parks and national monuments, more specifically national parks. To illustrate this a little bit further, I've got some other examples. So on the left, you have examples of larger parks that are a little bit more well-known, a little bit that exist in more populous areas, but still have huge economic outputs and employ quite a lot of people for their communities. And then on the left, you have similarly parks that are really, really small or in small areas with small populations, but continue to have million-dollar effects on the economic output of those regions. And so when you take into account the numbers in Utah, obviously are a little bit more dramatic, but when you take into account both the numbers that you can see in Utah and the numbers that you're seeing here with the national parks in the United States, you can see that these parks are playing a huge role in job numbers and spending and economic output and in value added to this country's GDP. Again, when you look at it massively, the number that the National Park Service provides for the United States GDP is not that large. But when you look in specific communities and when you look in specific areas, you realize that these communities can see massive levels of growth just from a national park being proclaimed. And one thing that's a little bit that makes you nervous is everything that the current administration has done. And so, like I mentioned, when a national park is proclaimed, when it's changed from a national monument or whatever it's designated as before being a national monument, consistently there are spikes, and you can see in visitation. And you can see this on the websites of these national parks. Along with spikes in visitation, you also have spikes in value added, in purchasing that's done both in the park and around the park, and in economic output. And so these are the 5 most recent national parks that have been declared parks from something else. And I've got lists there of what they were before they were a park. Because when you look at the parks process, how a national park is created, obviously no one in Congress, the president, no one in state legislatures is advocating to make Zion National Park smaller, or Yosemite smaller, or Great Smoky Mountains smaller. No one is advocating to make a national park itself smaller, because obviously there would be huge public backlash, especially in those small communities that are so heavily reliant on the national park to improve their economy, right? And so because there's this level of backlash, Congress, the president, local legislature doesn't directly attack the National Park Service. They do via funding. Oftentimes there's a huge backlog in maintenance that needs to be done in national parks, but they don't directly suggest, hey, we should open up these parks to oil drilling, to logging, whatever it is. What is in peril, what is currently being attacked is land that's designated for other uses. Bureau of Land Management land, National Forest Service land, national monuments that are run by either of those 2 organizations that are not run by the National Park Service. Great examples are Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ear were both just at the beginning of Trump's administration, both of them were diminished. Their size was taken down. It was cut down. Another good example that we tend not to think about is the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument right on the border in Arizona, which, again, that's not something that we have a tendency to think about. But with the border wall, with the challenges and with the direct attempts to build a border wall, they have destroyed a lot of the land and a lot of the beauty that exists in that area. And so to really understand why does this, because public lands, obviously, whether or not they're a national park, they do create value. But my argument is that national parks or national park system units directly have a greater value. They have a greater intrinsic value to the people. They get more marketing, they get more focus in the public. And so why should we care about what's happening to BLM national monuments or to National Forest Service land, or these places that we have a tendency not to think about? Most recently, Tongass National Forest has been opened up to logging in Alaska. And so the question is, why should we care? Why should we care about these regions? And we should care because a lot of these regions were set aside by the National Antiquities Act, for one. And for two, you just have to understand what the process is for creating new national parks. Because if national parks indeed are creating such a high level, which they are, such a high level and seeing such growth in the economy, we should be actively focusing on ways to add more park service system units, to add more service units so that we can increase the economic benefit of the National Park Service in our country, to become more and more reliant on the money that we are taking from this instead of other industries that are a little bit more volatile, because national parks, so long as they're treated well, are long-term. They exist for a long time. They're permanent to some degree. And so the question is, why do we focus on Bureau of Land Management land or Forest Service land? Because a lot of the national parks that we have today first existed as something else, whether it was BLM land, National Forest Service land, which you can see in Pinnacles, which was under the Forest Reserve designation before being set aside as a national monument. A lot of this land started as something else. It started as Forest Service land. It started as local memorials, local monuments, locally state parks, things to that effect, right? And if we shred these lower level areas, these areas that are run by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, if we shred them, we clear cut them, we destroy the natural resources, we destroy the water resources, we destroy the public appeal, there's no possible way in the future for us to help it become a national park or be part of the National Park Service, right? A great example of that is you look at Tahoe. Lake Tahoe, there were several movements to get Lake Tahoe protected as a national park, but there was too much logging done in the area. It was clear cut too much. There was too much logging. And when a lot of those activists, I believe John Muir was one of them, when they went into the Tahoe area, they said, this isn't worth protecting because it's already been destroyed. And that's what we have to worry with places with, like the Minnesota boundary waters or the Bering Sea or Tongass National Forests, roadless areas. We have to worry about these regions because if we destroy them now and we take the short-term profits from these areas, whether it be from oil and gas or from lumber or grazing, whatever it is, if we take these short-term benefits, we lose out on the potential to have a long-term benefit, right? The curve will shift. The short term may be very profitable, but in the long term, we're not going to be able to take a profit, and we're just going to have shredded lands that are valueless to our federal government. They're useless. They can't be used for anything because they've been destroyed. And so the question is, in the question of why should we care about Bureau of Land Management lands? Because these national monuments that are being protected by the Antiquities Act if they're being taken, and if the Antiquities Act is being ignored, they're saying the public lands, we're going to open them up to mining and to logging and to other similar industries, then we destroy the potential future, the long run opportunities to make money from this land. So a couple of numbers that I want to leave with you. Between 2012 and 2019, there was almost a $15 billion growth in the National Park Service in the economic output that the National Park Service gave. That is an incredible number. That number is an increase of 15 billion. That is remarkable, and it is meaningful to our country's GDP. The next number that I want you to remember is the 1.9, almost $2 billion that is provided annually by the Great American Outdoors Act. If you want to make a good return on your investments, you have to make sure to put in an adequate amount of money into that investment. So again, this is the level of growth that we're seeing in our country, in our National Park Service and our NPS units. This is the level of economic output that we're seeing, the growth that we're seeing over a 7-year span. Imagine what we could do with more park units, with better marketing, with better pay for our park staffers. Imagine what we can do just by putting money, investing money into our park service system. And then look at the number, how much we are putting into this system. While $2 billion seems like a lot of money, and it's a great start, don't get me wrong, if we are intending as a country, if we want to see returns from the National Park Service, if we want to see high levels of returns from visitation, both inside the park and the local economies around, if we want to help local small economies, small businesses in these little tiny communities that exist next to national park units, we need to be investing more than a measly $2 billion a year. If you want to see high returns, you need to put in more money. And yes, it's a risk. It's a risk that we're going to plateau. It's a risk that these park service units need high levels of maintenance. And that's predominantly what this money is being used for, is for maintenance of trails, of roads, of buildings, and the current national park units. But if we want to increase the amount of money that we're taking from the Park Service, increase the level of economic growth that we're seeing as a result, we need to be putting in more money. We need to be investing more money into these units. If you're interested in my sources, these are some of the references. A lot of the numbers that I have pulled come directly from the park website, the National Park Service website, and directly from their interactive tool that they have. I definitely suggest looking at the economic analysis that they did for this past year of 2019. It's really interesting to see what's happening in the West and to see the levels of growth that even some of the smaller units have seen over the last 5 to 7 years. So I definitely suggest looking at that. Hope you enjoyed my presentation.